Hello, and welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Careers. My name is Claudia Malad, and on today's episode, we have Pam Johnson, who's focused mainly on building a career around social justice, supporting individuals with disabilities through all walks of life, and developing leaders for the nonprofit sector through her teaching. I hope you enjoy. Hi, Pam. Welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Careers. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Claudia. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
Good.
So as you know, our podcast is all about people's career journeys, career paths. So to begin this episode, can you please introduce yourself, obviously your name, your position here at the college, and something you are passionate about?
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So I'm Pamela Johnson. You can call me Pam. I am a professor here at Conestoga College. I am teaching in a program called Management and Community Services. So really we're supporting people who are working in the nonprofit community services sector to become leaders and stronger leaders. What am I passionate about? I guess like since I was a little kid, I was really passionate about issues related to social justice.
Okay.
And I think that's driven me to do the work that I do today, and really drives a lot of the work that I do in my personal life too. So yeah, I think that's it. Yeah.
That's awesome. Great introduction. Thank you for that. Can you tell us a little bit about your career journey? So if your childhood dreams and goals were, fighting for social justice, obviously it took you to where you are today, but tell me, how did you get to where you are right now?
Oh my gosh. I was, the other day I was teaching a class and I was sharing giving my own context to the students and sharing that my dad, who was a labor unionist, took me to my first protest on Parliament Hill when I was 8 years old. And I was just sort of like, I don't know what I'm doing. I think he brought me as a prop, really. It was just like this cute little kid holding a sign. But I think I was a really sensitive kid, and I grew up in low income neighborhoods and recognized that I watched my own family struggling, and I got to know a lot of also really amazing, diverse families, and all my friends were kids who were sometimes refugees or newcomers to Canada. And I think I just recognized that the people around me, no matter how beautiful and wonderful and smart they were facing much greater challenges than other people in our community. So they were facing barriers that just seemed to come out of nowhere. I didn't understand it at the time. It just seemed really unfair. So I think as a young person in high school, I had ambitions to be actually a doctor.
Nice.
And I had a guidance counselor who sort of reminded me that my math marks weren't great. So I kind of said, you might want to redirect your energies. So at the time too, I had some people in my life who were steering me towards social work and psychology. And so I think my ambitions were to do something meaningful. I got very involved in environmental sustainability, activism, and activism around people who were living in cycles of poverty and people with low income. So I think that kind of drove my work forward. So so the career path was sort of like wanting to help people. And I think as a kid, I was thinking that you do that as a doctor, as a family physician. And so when I ended up actually working primarily with people living with disabilities, it sort of took me by surprise. But once I settled into the work, it felt like I always belonged there. I guess sort of then my career path was very much shaped by my university career and then going on to college.
Okay. That's awesome. Can you tell me a little bit more about your education?
So I was mentioning earlier that I had hoped to go to medical school.
Yes.
And I got some advice to do a psych degree because I was interested in biology and medicine. So my focus was more on neuropsychology. It felt like also an easier entry point for me. I always found human beings fascinating, but not really understanding what psychology was about until I was, really partway through my degree. I recognized that actually when I was in my psychology, doing my psychology work or going through my courses, that I actually probably made a mistake and I should have gone into social work.
Okay.
Because psychology, as you know, the focus is a lot more about understanding pathology of the mind and supporting people through that journey of healing. And that's not all of it. I don't want to simplify it, but social work is looking at the pathology of community and society and how people find themselves in situations where they are often self-blaming about what's going wrong in their lives. And it's really about understanding things from a bigger systemic perspective. So I did psychology. I went then to college so that I could find work. And that was like practice-based. I did placements. It was amazing learning. I also learned a lot more about the disability social justice sort of perspectives and heard from amazing leaders in that college program. And then I ended up actually going back to school again later on while I was working full time and did a degree in human geography. And again, human geography is coming back to like trying to understand big systems, understand how things like state violence works, geopolitics, how that impacts people. Because I mean, I'd grown up in a place where I had a lot of friends who had come to Canada through, experiences around colonization and war. And so I think I was just really fascinated by that, but also thinking maybe I would teach in that area. But that really shaped my perspective around things like international development or so-called international development and what was happening sort of as that systems level, but internationally. So yeah. And then I was a perpetual student, Claudia. I was like constantly going back, and I started doing a bunch of social work courses at university and counseling courses as well, because they really helped me in my day-to-day work, working with individuals and families with disabilities. So yeah, I was so the path was, I think a lot of people from the outside might look at it and go like, it's all over the place, but it's very interconnected.
Yeah. Yeah. It made sense to you and it got you to where you are. So
yeah, that's it. Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yes.
And can you tell me a little bit more about the motivations for taking psychology? So you said initially you wanted to kind of go into med school or to become, the biological side of it, but what made you, I guess, stay in that psychology program?
Well, I mean, I think, coming from a household where we really didn't have any money, I got a grant because I was like a good student and I worked really hard, but I had a stick with itness. I guess that came from a hardworking family who were like, if you start something, don't change it. So I didn't want to feel like a failure and I stuck with it in that way. I guess psychology was the closest to biology that I could get. Thinking that I wouldn't be heavily, math sort of focused courses, rather than going into a biology degree. But interestingly enough, I was really drawn to sort of the neurological psychology, and the biology of the brain and sort of how that impacts, of course, the way that we think and act and behave in our lives. So, but
I think it stems from that desire to wanting to be a doctor, right? So it's the most scientific aspect of it that you're focused on.
Exactly. Like I would get really excited when we'd be looking at MRI and CT scans, it's like, but the physiology of the brain was really fascinating, but it was, then of course the social side of psychology was really fascinating because inherently I was a really social kid and I was really interested in what was going on in my community and the people around me. Yeah.
The other piece that you mentioned was going to college after you got your psych degree. And you mentioned specifically, it was practical and you got that work experience. Can you talk a little bit more about your college background and what you studied at college?
Yeah. So when I was doing my psych degree, I got to talk with some of my high school friends who had actually chosen to go to college. I had some just misunderstandings of what the college experience could give me. And they were finding work right out of college. They were finding work. They were, being paid a reasonable rate. Yeah. They were advancing in their career when I was still trying to figure out what I was going to do. Right. And I had continued to work part-time with people living with disabilities, like little bits here and there, but I hadn't had a full-time job. And so I'd heard about this disability support worker program as a DSW program that still exists in the colleges and, has continued to be a really amazing program. Got to teach in it eventually. But that program was basically teaching you how to support people living with disabilities in a number of different settings. And it was like, had a really great range of courses, especially like placement opportunities.
Okay.
Right. So I was learning from a lot of, again, leaders in the sector back in my hometown. And so I applied, I got into the program, and I knew immediately it was the right choice for me. It was basically taking a lot of the conceptual theoretical work that we were doing in psychology. And it was like, this is what happens in real life.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what it means for people to live with a particular diagnosis or a disability. And so it was much more about the practice. Yeah. So it was, I tell everybody, like, if you're struggling to find opportunities post university, definitely think about practice-based learning in a college if there's an opportunity for you.
No, that's amazing. So those experiences kind of came to life. Yeah. Really what it is.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Yeah. It took all of the theory and it basically put it into practice for me.
Yeah. That's great. So circling back to, I guess, the young Pamela, can you tell us a little bit about your first job ever, whether it was your first paid job, your first job after graduation? Tell us about that experience.
Yeah, I think, I had a lot of jobs through school because I was kind of helping my family out along the way and just trying to cover my own costs. But my first big job really landed when I started college. So I was working with people with disabilities, and it just, I think it completely opened up my world to the range of services and supports that are available to people with disabilities in our community, but also recognizing that range is nowhere near as comprehensive as it needs to be. So I got to spend a lot of time with people with disabilities who are activists, their families who are really strong activists and advocates. And I think it really helped shape the way that I saw the system. So when I started doing, when as a kid, I didn't understand what barriers were about, but I think that systems analysis started at that point in my career, was I recognized what sort of norms were happening in our community and in our society that were perpetuating the challenges that people were facing.
Absolutely. And such important work in particular. So working with individuals with disabilities, what exactly did you do with them? How did you support them?
Yeah, well, when I was younger, it was a range of things. Like I worked for one organization where I was supporting people who were living semi-independently, some people who were had total care needs. And so meaning that I was helping with their daily care, but also taking them out into community. And basically they were my bosses. So they were telling me what they wanted to do, what activities were important to them. Their families also helped direct what that looked like, depending on their level of, their ability to communicate sort of their needs. I then also worked in school system and worked with a lot of kids with learning disabilities and intellectual disabilities. And worked also with older kids who were looking to be sort of more closer to job ready. So helping them in employment situations and finding work. So so a range of like early experiences working with kids who had been through the foster care system as well with Children's Aid Society, and sort of navigating through those experiences. So I also got some training when I was really young around person-centered planning and facilitation for kids who are going through big transitions in their lives. So helping them sort of work through what the next steps were. So really getting excited about asking people, what are your desires and ambitions in your own life? Because unfortunately, I think a lot of people who experience big barriers in their lives are not asked those questions.
It's true.
Yeah,
it's true. And then to navigate that and to know what comes next and what comes after that could be such a stressful factor for someone, right? You're thinking you're in this situation. How do I overcome that and move beyond that? Absolutely.
And I think that sometimes there's a narrative where you believe that it's something about what's wrong with you, like something that you've done wrong, and it really has nothing to do with anything you've done wrong. It's really about systemic barriers that are connected to a part of your identity. And so that's incredibly frustrating for people because it's a narrative that's so hardwired that we can keep telling ourselves those stories. And there's a lot of things around us telling us that same story. So it was about people retelling their own stories. So,
and that's so powerful for them to overcome that because it's their lived experience and they can find ways out of it and solutions just by having a conversation with you.
absolutely. Well, I
Yeah.
think, I think it's, once you rethink about, reframe how you think about who you are, it changes everything.
Mhm.
And you can't go back to thinking the other way anymore. It stops you in your tracks. I think that, it was interesting because this is related. I just to make sure, there were some families who would come to me and say, my child has really struggles with being assertive, and I don't know what that's about. And at the time, I didn't question it a whole lot either. I just thought, oh, okay, well, just that's, sometimes maybe it's learned helplessness that we have, not recognizing that a lot of people who face tremendous barriers and bias are taught to be quiet and taught that their voices don't matter. So assertiveness is not a big surprise, like that you're not assertive. So then we would go like, oh, like, let's see if there's some courses. And there would be like these organizations, like person-driven organizations that are like people with disabilities running them and talking to other people with disabilities about how to organize, how to feel good about who you are, et cetera. And they'd come out of these courses and they'd say, my kid is so aggressive now. What's going on?
So it's the exact opposite of what they wanted.
I'd be like, well, that's the thing about assertiveness is that you have to be prepared that people are going to use their voices once they recognize that something's not working, or that they've been hushed for a long time and they've found their voice. Then you have to be prepared they're going to use it, and you have to create space where they can exercise that autonomy and that fierceness, maybe.
Absolutely, and it's so needed. It's empowering individuals that didn't feel that way before. So as much as they may be more aggressive, it's in their best interest and it's for their own good.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, having worked in the system and different multiple levels and working in government, et cetera, I find like the biggest change that we see happening in our communities are thanks to advocates and activists. That it's not like, there's a lot of great ideas that come from big institutions, but they're mostly generated from community members, right? They're demanding and they're identifying needs. And so if we hush those voices, we don't see change and evolution. So I think it's really important to foster that and support those voices and make sure that they're always included in the conversations about, big decisions that are being made about people in our community generally.
Absolutely, because to those policymakers and system makers, everything's working just fine, right?
Yeah.
It's when someone who's a part of that system or the broken system is able to identify and speak up against these things. It's like, oh,
that's right.
We didn't see that side of it.
Yeah. Having conversations with people who are doing fine is not really about changing systems, right?
Yeah, 100%. So can you tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are now? So you worked, advocating, supporting individuals with disabilities, various forms of disabilities, but how did we fast forward to now the faculty member here at Conestoga College?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, I mean, when I was working doing casework in community, so I was doing case management, and then I was doing planning. I had an opportunity. A couple of my my college professors asked me to come back to Algonquin College and teach in our program. And so not really, I knew I'd done a lot of group facilitation and I really enjoyed that, but I wasn't sure about teaching. And then I did it and I really enjoyed it. I loved being back in the classroom with the students, and they'd always, sort of describe me as being so wide-eyed and excited about everything. But I really loved what I did. I don't think there was a day that I wasn't excited to go to work. And so I started doing that. I was doing a bit of part-time teaching concurrently while I was working as a leader in the sector. I eventually moved on to doing a few directors' roles. And then what happened was like a total sort of coming apart in my personal life. My mother was diagnosed when I was quite young with dementia.
Oh, no.
And my dad subsequently was. My brother had a catastrophic accident and my marriage ended. Like there was a bunch of things that happened well within about 2 years. And I don't know about anybody who's listening, but sometimes when really big change happens, it forces you to think really differently about everything in your life.
Of course.
And sometimes it's, you don't want that tragedy to happen or those difficult things to happen, but they're going to happen. And sometimes they compel you to do something differently.
Mm-hmm.
And so what it did was it reminded me that I desperately wanted to do master's work.
Okay.
I was kind of working towards a master's in social work at the time.
Okay.
And a bunch of my colleagues who were other executive directors and nonprofits said, I don't know that that's going to help you run this organization. You're working with like 50 unionized employees. You need to learn how to, manage a budget of $2 million, et cetera, and find money, do an MBA. And so, it felt like a betrayal somehow. No offense to the MBAs out there, but like, it just felt like a wrong.
To disconnect.
Right.
Yeah.
So it was just like, what is this? But it turned out I had to shop around for the right MBA. And I found this amazing MBA in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, in community economic development. And I found my people there.
Perfect.
So I went out there and it was also a reset. I knew I wanted to do something a bit different in my career at the time, but I wasn't sure exactly what. I had this beautiful career that I'd fostered over like almost 20 years in Ottawa in the developmental services sector, but I wanted something different. So I went out there and I sort of anticipated being out there for a short period of time and did my degree, my master's, and I started doing research and I loved research. I realized that I was pretty good at it and I enjoyed it. It was community-based, applied research, again, taking all those values I have in social justice and bringing that into the type of research I was doing. And I just found some amazing mentors and wonderful community members. And that place is a hotbed of social justice activity.
Of course.
There's so much of like the union movement, cooperative movement, credit union movement, which is my family was very embedded in and a part of. It allowed me to get sort of involved in that out there. And then I ended up working at a place called the Coady International Institute at St. Francis Xavier University and running a women's leadership program for about 5 years. So
amazing.
Yeah.
What a great experience. It sounds like life had its twists and turns for you, but you always found a way to bounce back. So that's beautiful. And I'm glad that you did the MBA after all, because it just, to me, seems like MSW would be perfectly aligned with everything that you've done, but this just worked out so much better.
It really did. And it opened up a bunch of doors. I mean, I think that any kind of education, any furthering of your education is going to help you.
Of course.
It's never something I've ever looked back and go like, wow, I really regret doing all of that work and investing in my education ever. Even if it's not completely applied to something I'm doing right now, I always have transferable skills that I can pull into the job. And so, it opened up a brand new career for me. And so that was really exciting to do that. Like just as I was coming up to 40, it was really, because
you weren't expecting it, right? It kind of just surprised you. It came out of nowhere.
That's right.
You'd mentioned earlier that you've been, I guess, directors of various non-for-profit organizations. Can you tell me a little bit about some of those non-for-profit organizations you worked for?
Yeah, so they were organizations supporting adults with intellectual disabilities in Ottawa. One organization I joined just as I was coming out of a big project. I was working with the provincial government of Ontario to close institutions for people with intellectual disabilities and help them move back into their communities. And so that was a huge project. It really was changing a lot of community services in community. So I had moved into that organization just at the end of that project. And the organization had gone through just tremendous upheaval and change. They had like 9 executive directors in 8 years.
Oh my gosh.
So big changes. So the staff were just, I think, looking for some solid leadership. And I mean, a lot of really amazing people. And the people we were serving were wonderful too. So I worked with them for a couple of years. And then there was the challenge that I was explaining that, my family was going through some pretty big changes. And so I ended up leaving there and moving on to another organization where I was able to actually balance caregiving for my mom and still be a director. And I was working with an organization called the Ottawa Rotary Home. And they're an amazing organization that provide respite specifically to families whose kids have maybe complex medical issues. So the kids need a break from their families and the families need a break. And then they also provide adult services too. So they're an amazing organization.
Yeah. Sounds like it. Great opportunities there for sure. For sure. So let's talk a little bit about your experience now here at Conestoga. I know you said you were a faculty member, but what does a typical, I guess, day or semester look like for you?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I think, we have, we're running a hybrid program we're working with people, domestic students, international students, students who are coming to us basically trying to either look at their leadership potential within the sector or to hone skills and abilities that they haven't had the opportunity to do. Like I can say that this is the program I needed desperately when I was an ED, but I didn't have access to. So I ended up doing an MBA in CD, which was great. But I needed a program that was going to teach me, the ins and outs of HR and how to do fundraising and grant writing and how to be a manager and a leader and how to engage in activism and how to work with other community members and build sort of a sense of collectivism. So our program basically runs usually September to April.
Okay.
The students are amazing. They're varied. They're from all over the world, and some domestic students who are usually mostly a part of our program through continuing education.
Okay.
And so they all bring their own stories, et cetera, and their lived experiences. So very early in the semester, I usually send out what I call an asset map. And this is an activity that we often do in community building, which is basically asking people like, what are the gifts and strengths you bring to this program?
Okay.
How do you want to grow? What are the skills that you hope to acquire? And then we share the map with everybody in the class. And I sort of encourage students regularly to say, if there's a skill that you're hoping to acquire, look on the asset map first and see if you want to take one of your colleagues out for coffee and ask them about how they got to where they, they got to where they are. So if they're really strong in a particular area, then talk to them about it. So I also find that it's helpful to me and the other profs to sort of to see those strengths in their backgrounds so that we can really appreciate people at the get-go. Just this past year, I've started including some of those leaders in the classroom in doing co-lectures with me around particular areas where they are really skilled.
Yeah.
So in particular, social economy class, I'm doing a lecture later on this afternoon with a really wonderful woman in our program. And so just trying to find ways of featuring students and recognizing that they're coming into these programs like most adults are with a ton of lived experience and really great stories and strengths. So just trying to figure out where we can feature those in our program.
I love that. I love the idea of the asset map. I love the idea of co-facilitating because you're empowering those students, plus the other students in the audience that maybe don't have that much lived experience can hear from their classmate or their colleague.
Yeah.
So with that being said, how important is networking in your industry or profession?
Oh my gosh. Like every profession, right? It's so important.
Yes.
Like it's important to, first of all, network so that you can figure out, I try to encourage people to always look for people whose careers inspire you. Maybe it's like, that's where I want to be. Go and talk to that person. Ask them what their career trajectory, their career trajectory looked like. How did they get to where they are today? What were the steps that they took? That person might become a sponsor for you. They might become a coach. They might be a mentor. They might have a role in your life. I think that networking is so important. I tell students all of the time, especially newcomer students to Canada, I'm like, show up at the opening of an envelope, which means basically show up to everything.
Yep.
Show up in community events, show up to, especially in our sector, show up to gatherings where people are talking about major social issues.
Of course.
The more they see your face and they recognize that you're interested and you care about this issue, the more likely they're going to think of you to invite you to maybe another event, or perhaps if you're looking for a job and you're the one who walks through the door, they recognize you from the event that you showed up at. Share your voice, share your experiences. And I think networking too, I'm always telling students, like, if you're not on LinkedIn, get on LinkedIn just because, employers are going there. But it's a place where you can share posts and ideas about things that are important to you or interesting to you. So I think networking is so important. So if there's any opportunities, I try to also, the college is always putting out these great activities. Students get out there and meet people.
Absolutely. You kind of echoed everything that we say in our classes to our students about networking and the importance of it as well. So kind of on a similar note with regards to networking, you mentioned, I think, a little bit about your experience with mentorship. Have you been a mentor or have you mentored others?
Yeah, I've been both mentored and mentored others, and both formally and informally. There's a really wonderful program through the Women's Economic Council of Canada where they have a newcomer program where you can mentor newcomer women. They sort of try to match you up based on your interests. And so I've been able to do that. I've been a mentor through some of the women's leadership programs that we're running through the organization I was working in. And then, of course, more informally with younger women or younger men in the sector. I love it when people come to me and they want to talk to me about their fears and their hopes and their dreams and their excitement and their disappointments, because I know that it's a point in time.
Yeah.
Sometimes people sort of think like this defines everything that's going to happen to me. You're like, no. Don't worry about that. This is this is the learning moment. It's a pivot. It's a change.
Yeah.
And let's dream about what's next. So a lot of that transition planning that happened earlier on in my career, with people with disabilities, I use a lot of that in my mentoring now. It's to think about, where do you want to be? What do you hope to do? What do you hope to accomplish? I remind people that I think there's a thread inside of us that carries with us, it's carried throughout our lives, and it's touches to our values. So even though we might change in our careers, a lot of who we are doesn't change, right? So those values and those ethics and those desires and passions. So I think just, supporting people at that time in their career is a real privilege. And I certainly have had so many amazing mentors who've reminded me of those things too.
Absolutely. So are there any key projects or initiatives you're working on right now that you'd want to share on this podcast?
Sure. Yeah. I think one particular project through the college that I was started last year with 3 students. So I was able to supervise 3 students from our program to do a bit of a research project, but it was really based in getting to know leaders in our sector. So there's a lot of published case studies that are for, tech sector, business, et cetera. Often sectors that maybe have a bit more money or infrastructure to spend in those areas. And so the stories that we're telling about leaders in our classroom, about in our nonprofit sector, they were harder to find. Sometimes they're on websites. If we search hard enough, we can find them. And I wanted the students to help me gather some of those stories. So we interviewed 10 leaders. And the students did an amazing job. It was a great opportunity for them to network, to learn how to look for those really important themes, to engage in writing and project management. So they did that last year, and I was really proud of them, what they turned out. And we had great conversations with these leaders. So now we're just at the point of turning those into products, learning products. So we're going to be working with the Open Education Resource Department at Conestoga. They've been wonderful support. Looking at our first case study is going to be reviewed later this week. And then a couple of projects I've been working on with students in this past semester have been around the potential for matched housing between newcomer students and elders in our community. Another one is also looking at the experiences of newcomer students using transit in Brantford and Kitchener-Waterloo, specifically around the issues around racism that they've experienced while using transit. So we've submitted a proposal, a grant proposal, to see if we can take that a little further. We've got some excited partners. So that's kind of what I'm working on right now at the college.
Very exciting stuff. And I think super important stuff that is relatable to all the students, especially international students using transit. That's the reality of the situation. And then, of course, if their experience is horrible, that's unfortunate, but you're bringing it to light. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think we just want to better understand what's happening, the good and the bad and the ugly, and how we can also address it and support people through it. So I think the students teach me what needs to be focused on. These are not ideas that are generated by me. They're generated from conversations I have in the classroom and from the amazing leaders that we have who come through our program and talk to us about what's important to them.
I guess future goals for yourself. You have an impressive career, so much activism and social justice, but what are any future goals for yourself or plans for your career moving forward?
I think I'm at the stage in my career now that I think when I was maybe about 10 years younger, it was about going up, up, up. And I've had wonderful opportunities to be an administrator and be a leader in an organization. I think for me now, it's about deepening and meaning. And so I get a lot out of my interactions with people in community and with students. And I think if I can continue to work on meaningful projects that look at applied change in community, something that's going to maybe make people's lives a little more pleasant, and maybe where we see some contributions towards bigger systemic change. That's kind of my focus at this point. So my research work, my teaching and learning is really centering around that at this point in my career. So yeah, I think
super important things and all needed things, definitely. Yeah. So I'm very excited to hear that and what's on the horizon for you.
Thanks.
In terms of just generally your career, things that are happening in the future, how would you say artificial intelligence has had an impact on your sector or your industry?
Oh my goodness. It's had so many, positive and challenging sort of impacts, right? I think that for those of us working in the not-for-profit sector, we are stretched. We're so stretched. We're always trying to do so much more with very little money, or sometimes even shrinking money. And so I think that AI can provide a lot of support in terms of, grant writing proposal and those sorts of things. We always have to make sure that we bring a critical eye to everything that we're going to use AI for. But I think, in the sector and the learning and education sectors, there's also tons of opportunities, and I can see them, but it's also presented a bunch of challenges around authenticity and originality. So I think both myself and I think our colleagues, we're really trying to focus on meaning and analysis. So when we're talking with students, is really about how much do you understand? What are you getting out of this? How is that impacting the way that you think and you problem solve through this? What's your analysis? So if we can use the AI tools in different ways that we can sort of build our ideas and pull projects together. But I still want to hear that originality in the way that somebody's interpreting it based on their own lived experience. So I don't want to lose that. That's, I think, the one thing about the flatness of AI is that it doesn't bring that person out forward. And that's who I'm interested in.
Right. You need that authenticity piece there.
Totally.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
So what gives you hope for the future? What gives you hope?
Oh my gosh. It gives me hope is that people they keep coming to school with energy and excitement and a yearning for learning and wanting to do exciting things in their lives. Like I get to encounter people who are just starting. Like that's
very exciting.
Right?
Yeah.
Or people who are just making a big pivot in their career. And it's such a generative time in your life. And I love that. I think there's a lot of hope. There's a ton of energy and there's a ton of possibility. So I think that that's what keeps me going. It gets me excited. I'm always happy to come to work. I always want to try new things and engage in new projects, but is that I get to be around people who are still fresh in their learning and who are hopeful. Yeah.
All right. One last question for you. Okay. We kind of discussed your whole career, but what advice would you give to your younger self? So talking to yourself and maybe say 20, 30 years ago, what advice would you give to yourself?
Oh my gosh. That's a good one. I think would be don't get too stuck with an idea that you think really has to define your life.
Okay.
Like you're going in with a really fixed idea of what you should be accomplishing. And more importantly, just be open to trying all of the doors that are going to open up for you. And if they're not going to open up, bang really hard and you get through those doors, especially if you want to get to the other side of things. So just don't get too stuck on a fixed idea of who you are and who you have to be in your life, because what's more ultimately important is that, what's important to you, your goals, your values, they need to shine through in everything that you do.
Absolutely.
So if it's in a defined position, that's not necessarily the best definition of sort of who you are in a particular job or role, because that could change.
Yeah. Yeah. Your authentic self needs to come through.
That's it.
Definitely.
Yes.
Definitely. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming in today, Pamela.
Thanks, Claudia.
Great to see you on the podcast.
So great to meet you. Yeah, yes. I appreciate this.
Thank you. What an inspiring conversation. Thank you for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Careers. If you like this episode and want to hear more, follow us on Spotify and subscribe to us on YouTube. See you in the next one.